Hello there, ladies. We are getting close to the end of CC4 now. So this is I think the 9th presentation in the narrated PowerPoints to cover CC4. So we're looking at from page 57 in your CC4 booklet, the one with the yellow cover. And we've got a couple of multi-choice, one multi-choice question, and then profit maximisation question I'd like you to take a look at, which we'll go through together now. And then we're going to look at profit maximisation and marginal profit, the functions of profit, and also look at a couple of questions that require you to do a little bit of reading, and also then explain, in this case, why a couple of organisations' profits may have fallen. When we get to that point, we'll also then look at the micro and macroeconomic effects of falling company profits. And we'll do that almost as a sort of essay plan of sorts. And then we'll move on to look at technological change in markets. Now, I think probably that will be the subject of another PowerPoint rather than doing it all in one. But we'll see how we go. And obviously, we can have a catch-up later on today in terms of how you're coping with the level of work that's being set. Okay, so let's take a look on page 57 then, this multi-choice question on the Royal Mail. So if you look on page 57, you'll see the question says in December 2009, the Royal Mail announced that it had made a 4% increase in profits compared to 2008, despite a fall in 3 million items a day in the amount of post being sent. The most likely reason for the increase in profits was, so it's a multi-choice question, you've got 5 options to choose from. Have a look at those options and see which one you can come up with and try and explain the reasons why you've chosen one over another, okay? And in some cases, it might be a bit of a process of elimination. But I'll leave you to have a go at that question in the first instance. And you might want to stop the PowerPoint and just have a go at that question, see what you can come up with, and then we'll look at the answer together, okay? So I'll leave you to do that, and then we'll come straight back and start to look at the answer. Okay, so let's take a look at the response to this question then. So we've got a situation here where we've got rising profit and falling quantities simultaneously. So normally speaking, you wouldn't think that you'd get both of those happening at the same time, would you? So there's clearly going to be a reason for that. If we take a look at how we might be able to break that down, it might be that we've got a disproportionate increase in price. So as a result of that, our total revenue might be up, or we could have had a fall in costs. And so either one of those things could have actually effectively caused an increase in profits. So let's take a look at what the answer was. D is most likely to be the scenario. So effectively, if we had a fall in employment in the Royal Mail, that would mean that one of the biggest costs that the Royal Mail has, obviously, is wages. So in this instance, that would mean that costs could fall as a result. Let's take a look at some of the other alternatives as well and some of the rationale as to why that should be the case. The one thing to bear in mind, and it's not something we've looked at in a huge amount of detail, some of you might have been aware of it in having studied economics previously, is this principle of contestability, okay? So contestable markets, basically what happens is that in order for a market to become contestable, that means that to some degree there is going to be low barriers to entry and exit of a market, and also contestability is about bringing competition into a marketplace, okay? So if a market becomes contestable, it means that other firms might come into the market, and if other firms come into the market, that is clearly going to create some downward pressure on prices. And we'll look at market structures in the next booklet, CC5, where we'll look at the difference between perfectly competitive markets right the way through to monopoly markets, and some of it will become hopefully a little clearer as a result of that. Okay, so let's take a look at the next thing, the next exercise I'd like you to take a look at. Okay, so this is a bit of a profit maximisation exercise, and in this instance, oops, hold on, you've been given some information. And in this, the one really important thing to remember, as it says at the top of the page, or top of the table on 57, page 57, profit maximisation, the profit maximisation output rule is where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. And obviously in this situation we get to the point where marginal revenue and marginal cost are equal, but in essence the profit maximisation rule is that we'll keep on going until with marginal cost rising it actually equals marginal revenue. That's the point at which we would stop producing output. Okay, so you've been given some information, you've been given a range of quantities or output. You've also been given the total revenue figure from 25 to 50 to 75, as you can see in the first or the second column, labelled TR. You've also got your total cost, and so on the basis of that you should be able to calculate profit, marginal revenue, marginal cost, and also marginal profit. And again, you might need to look back at your notes, look at other examples that you've done, just to make sure you understand what the principles are. So the first activity is to have a go at completing that table. Okay, so I'll give you a few minutes to do that. More than a few minutes, you can take as long as you need to. But have a go at completing that first. And then you'll see that if you flick on to page 58, it's asking you to calculate a number of things. So there are 3 questions that you've been set to look at. Calculate profit, marginal cost, and marginal revenue. Number 1. Second, plot on 2 graphs, one above the other, total cost and total revenue, marginal cost and marginal revenue, and then identify the profit maximisation point where MC equals a MR on your graph. Okay, so that's going to give you a little bit of time to do that, because clearly not only have you got to do some calculations, you've also got to then put those graphs together, plot those graphs together, and also then make some comments and start to analyse it. Okay, so again, I'd suggest I'll stop the PowerPoint here and have a go at completing the table and also then doing the graphical bits and pieces. And again, we'll reconvene once you've done that. Okay, so welcome back. Now, in this instance, then, we're going to look at a number of things. Now, again, there's a lot of information that's given in this table that with a little bit of knowledge and also thinking about, in this case, the increments in changes in terms of total revenue and total cost, that you can actually start to highlight a few quite interesting things. I'm going to just move myself up there a wee bit so it's slightly easier for you to see all of this that's going on. So let's then take a look at how we might fill in this table and what is it going to give, what information is it going to tell us. So first things first, one of the things that you should be able to see in this case is that at different levels of output, you can see that in each case the level of revenue goes up by the same amount for each extra unit of output. So one could argue that as the total revenue is increasing in 25s and the output is only increasing by a factor of 1 in each case, that we're in a price taking situation here. So our total revenue is actually increasing in 25. So we're a price taker. We can't influence the price by anything that we do, and we're having to take the price that the market is telling us it's willing to pay. Okay, so that's first things first. So again, even just a simple activity looking at the total revenue and the magnitude by which it goes up for each level of output gives you some interesting information that you should be able to use. Okay, so what we're then going to need to do is to calculate profit. Well, we keep coming back to this principle, don't we, that profit is total revenue take away total cost. So if we take in the first case, we have got a scenario where our total revenue is 25, our total cost 35, so we've actually made a loss of 10. Second instance, where we've gone to 2 units of output, our total revenue is 50, total cost is 61, so again our profit in this case is still negative. Well, it's not profit, it's a loss. Our total costs are higher than our total revenue, so we made a loss of -11. However, we can see at unit level 3 units of output, we have total revenue and total cost equaling the same. So we've got to the point at which total cost and total revenue are equal. So we've reached break even, I suppose, or normal profits, or not necessarily normal profits, but certainly financially accounting and we reach break even in that situation. When we go to 4 units of output, we've got 100 units of revenue, 90 units of total cost, so we're now making a profit of 10. And on we go, so 19, 27, 27, 18, and -4. So we can see there's a bit of a pattern emerge there, hasn't there? So we've got to a point where we've actually covered total revenue and total cost, but then also, if we're thinking about this as a profit maximisation exercise, then we can probably see that at some point between 6 and 7 units, that is when we have the highest level of profit. Okay, 27 units, whatever that unit might be, let's call it pounds, £27 of profit for both 6 units and 7 units. So that would suggest that probably somewhere around about this area here, without knowing anything else, is likely to be where we're actually at profit maximisation, in terms of trying to make sure that total cost is at the lowest point it can be and total revenue is at the highest point to achieve profit maximisation. So we then need to calculate the marginal revenue. So that's the difference between the original amount of output, so in this case 1, and then how much extra revenue are we generating for the second unit of output. Now again, you'll see in the first instance where it's just 1 unit, well, there's no marginal revenue because there's not an extra or additional unit to produce, is it? But you should be able to see that the marginal revenue in each case is going to be 25. Okay, so for the extra unit that we're producing, you can see that in this case, total revenue is 50. Original revenue on 1 unit of output was 25. So the marginal revenue was 25. So again, that's suggesting this principle of total revenue increasing in 25s is number 1, that the marginal revenue will be the same each time. And effectively, because we're a price taker, we know that that's what's causing that as an issue, because normally speaking, that might actually change in some ways. Let's take a look at the marginal cost then. Okay, so again, in this case, what we're doing is looking at the difference in cost between 1 unit of output and 2 units of output. So in the first instance, again, we have no calculation to do because we only produce 1 unit of output. Second unit essentially is 26, so our marginal cost is 26. And effectively what we're doing there is taking the difference between our original cost for 1 unit, 35, and for 2 units, it's 61. So we take 35 away from 61 to get our 26 figure. Next scenario here then, where effectively we've got total cost at 61 for 2 units, 75 for 3 units. So our marginal cost is at 14. At 4 units, the difference is 15, so marginal cost goes from 75 to 90, so in that case it's 15. It goes up to 16 for 5 units, where we've got 106 units of total cost, as opposed to 90 with the previous level of output. It goes up to 17 at the point where we're at 6 units. So 123 total cost as opposed to 106 for the previous level of units, leaving 17 as our marginal cost. Then at 7 points, at 7 units, we have a situation where total cost has gone up significantly, and actually it's now at £25 for 25 units for that extra unit of production from 6 to 7. 8 again, 34, quite a big difference between those figures there. Our total costs have gone up significantly, so we're talking about 34 units increase in marginal cost, and then 47 for 9 units. So again, bit of a pattern emerging there. We can see that initially the total cost or the marginal cost was reasonably significant, and it fell quite a bit from between 2 and 3 units. And then started to climb, and then obviously went climbed to a very high degree when we were talking about 7, 8, and 9 units of output. So let's take a look at the marginal profit then. So that's the difference between marginal revenue and marginal cost. Okay, So in this case, we've calculated it all. So what we should be able to do is just take those two figures, marginal revenue and marginal cost, take them away from one another, and that will give us a picture. Well, we haven't got a calculation to do on the first example, but the second example, in this case, we have a marginal profit of -1. Okay, so in this case, our marginal cost for producing that extra unit is higher than the marginal revenue we're getting. So effectively, we would be making a small loss in that situation. Then there's a significant change. So you can see that again, our marginal revenue is 25, our marginal cost is 14. So we have a marginal profit for that extra unit of 11. Then it goes to 10 for 4 units. Then it goes to 9 for 5 units. Goes to 8 for 6 units. And actually goes to 0 at 7 units. Okay, so where our marginal revenue equals our marginal cost, we have no marginal profit. Now, really remembering the rule we talked about, profit maximisation, the point at which marginal cost equals marginal revenue is the point at which we would be producing if we were a profit maximizer. I'm not giving too much away by explaining that, but that's the main principle of what you need to understand as far as this particular part of the syllabus is concerned, as far as profit maximisation is concerned. When we go into the next level, you can see that we're into another loss. So effectively, marginal revenue was 25, and this is when I say a loss, a marginal loss. We're into £34 of marginal cost for producing the extra unit. So we would be making a marginal loss of 9 units on that extra unit that we produced. And then a significant difference at 9 units of output, where effectively we have made a marginal loss of 22, which is quite significant, isn't it? Okay, so those are the stats, or those are that's the pieces of information that you would need to calculate for your profit maximisation table. And let's take a look then at how that might work in terms of on page 58, where you've been asked to plot the two graphs and also show your profit maximisation point. So let's take a look at how that might appear. But obviously, one of the things to do, is to recognise, as we've been going through, the point at which, in this case, our profit maximisation point is where MC equals MR at 7 units, where effectively our marginal revenue and our marginal cost are the same. That would be our profit maximising level of output at 7 units. Okay, let's take a look at how these two graphs might look then. The way this has been computer generated, this example, so it's a bit stylized in the way that it's been produced, but hopefully what you should be able to see in this case, as you've been asked in the first instance, you need to plot total cost and total revenue, and we've also chosen to show profit in this instance, where effectively you can see that our total revenue is going up in a linear fashion, because for each item that we produce, or each item of output we sell, we're getting £25 or 25 units per item. So, and then you can see our total costs initially are slightly higher than our total revenue, and then they start to fall, and then they start to rise again. So at the point at which we're at 9 units, and we're getting towards 9 units, our total costs are now exceeding our total revenue. Okay, so that's the total revenue, total cost, and profit shown on the graph. We'll take a look at the second element then, okay, where we're talking about marginal revenue, marginal cost, and marginal profit. Then in this case, we can see that our marginal revenue is staying at 25 units per item of output. So it's a horizontal line. We are basically in a perfectly competitive market of some description. We cannot influence the price. We are a price taker rather than a price maker. But when we look at the marginal revenue and look at the marginal cost and the marginal profit, we can see that our marginal cost starts to fall quite significantly, and then it sort of levels off a wee bit, and then we get to a point at which marginal revenue and marginal cost are at the same point. Okay, and again, what we should be able to see is the point at which we can decide on our profit maximization level of output. So if we draw in a line up from the 7 units of output, you can see that this shows two things really. One is that there is the maximum gap on the total revenue and total cost curve, where effectively we have the biggest difference between total revenue and total cost at that point there. So it's a maximum gap between total revenue and total cost. So that means that our total revenue is greater than our total cost at that point, and that's the biggest gap between the two. So that would be our point of profit maximization in terms of revenue. The maximum total profit that you're going to achieve in this case, as you can see, is at that same level. Okay, you can see if we plot the maximum profit, that's the point at 7 units, that's the point at which we're going to get the highest maximum profit. When we then look at the situation here, okay, where effectively we've got marginal cost equaling marginal revenue, but where we can then see that marginal revenue is marginal cost is still rising, that's the point at which we would be producing if we were at the level of output we would be producing if we were a profit maximizer. You can see that at that point as well, which sort of just reinforces the point really, that at that same level of production, of output, the marginal profit, where marginal revenue take away marginal cost, that is also equal to 0. Okay, so we can see that if that were to change, if marginal revenue were to be higher than marginal cost, we would still carry on producing because there would be still more profit to be made. But if marginal cost is starting to get higher, then we are not going to want to produce in this area here, because clearly we're going to not be maximizing the level of profit that we could have done if we'd chosen to go down that different route. Okay, so let's take a look then on page 59. Hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. I'm just pop back to that. The information on the graph and also in the table hopefully start to make it a little bit more easy and straightforward to understand. So this principle is that if we're a profit maximizer, if we as a business have that as our main objective, then we will produce up to the point at which marginal cost equals marginal revenue, where marginal cost is still continuing to rise, as we've shown on the graph there. So there is a little bit of paperwork to take a look at on page 59, which just explains in a little bit more detail the reasons why profit maximization and marginal profit are clearly quite closely connected, and it's the point at which we would choose to either carry on expanding production or choose to stop that's the important principle to remember there. Okay, now we can show this in a sketch diagram. Okay, so you've got this in your table, you've got the table, you've got the graph on page 59. And also what we also need to do is just explain the principles, and if we were going to come up with a simple demonstration of marginal cost and marginal revenue and the profit maximization point, this would be a good way to go. Okay, so you can see that at output level A, we've got them A, B and C. At output level A, we have got, in this case, if we label up the axes as well, we've got marginal revenue and marginal cost curves drawn in there. Okay, so we've got a linear marginal revenue, but with it being downward sloping, that clearly is going to mean that we are going to have price varying for each different level of quantity that's produced. Okay, so there we have effectively from our initial sort of equilibrium point, we've also drawn in some and marked up the various different lines that we've got showing. Okay, so if we then take a look at the point at which we're talking here, output level A, well, clearly our marginal revenue line is significantly higher and at output level A than the marginal cost curve. So a profit maximizing firm should probably increase its output at this point, okay, because clearly one could argue, well, actually they are making quite a significant amount of profit there, but actually they can make even more. They would, if they just said, well, that's where we're going to settle, they would be wasting the potential profit of these extra units to the point at which marginal cost is still below marginal revenue. Okay, so at that point there, that would actually make extra marginal profits rather than just stopping at output point A. Okay. If we then take a look at output level C, then okay, so effectively here, if that were the case, marginal revenue is actually lower than marginal cost, and so a profit maximizing firm should actually decrease its output because at that point it would be making marginal losses. Okay. Now, if we then take a look at those two pressures, if you like, the one of actually moving from A to B, where effectively if we'd stopped at A, we would be foregoing some of the profit that we could make between our marginal cost line still being below our marginal revenue line. And at that point, at output level B, our marginal revenue and our marginal cost equals the same. Okay, we're in market equilibrium, if you like, so marginal cost equaling marginal revenue, and so the profit maximizing firm should actually maintain that level of output. Okay, now in terms of explaining that and showing profit maximization, that's a really good way of doing so. As you'll see when we start to look at CC5, the next booklet in the series, it starts to get slightly more complicated when you actually are drawing in long run average cost curves and also revenue curves, etc. But the same principle applies. Okay, so I think what I'd like you to do, I think we'll carry on. I think just to finish this bit off, there is on page 59 under the graph that we just explained. There's some details on the functions of profit. I'd like to have a read through that, highlight the bits that you think are most relevant, and it's really talking about what sort of things does profit do, what sort of functions does it have. And we've talked about profit being a return for risk taking for the entrepreneur, but also in some cases profit is important because if you've got a limited company, you've got to pay out dividends to shareholders, you've got to try and encourage them to buy more shares by being successful, and there are a range of different other elements within that function of profit, particularly when we're talking about profit and how it might act as a market signal. So for instance, if businesses can see that a market is particularly profitable, that's going to create an incentive for new firms to actually move into that industry. Okay. Now, clearly, the other thing you've got to bear in mind is that profit is quite an important principle, and the government is quite keen for businesses to make profits, because if they do, then because they're charged corporation tax, that will mean that the government will be getting more money into their coffers to be able to then spend on developing the economy further. Okay, so there's a whole range of different functions of profit, which again are really quite important for you to understand. But have a look at that on the bottom of page 59, and that will give you some sort of clear understanding of that. Okay. Now, the next thing I'd like you to do is to take a look at the two articles that are included on page 60. Okay, so relatively short articles there. One talking about Facebook and one talking about Mulberry. And in these instances, there are some issues around those two organisations, and both have had profit falls. Okay, both for quite significant differences. But what I'd like you to do is have a read through that. You might want to go and do a little bit of research into those two organisations, and maybe even look at those articles that are available online. But they summarise some of the issues that those two businesses are facing. Okay, and if we've got falling profits, well, there's an argument to say that that's not a good position for a business to be in, particularly if it's quite a big business and maybe is a limited company or a public limited company that relies on share value and share price to be able to move forward. So have a read of those articles and then try to jot down a few things as to why you think the profits have fallen in both Facebook and Mulberry. They are quite different reasons, as we'll see. Okay, so I'd like to stop the presentation, have a go at just reading those articles and then answering those questions, and then we'll take a look together. Okay, so Facebook then. In this instance, one of the issues around the Cambridge Analytica controversy was Facebook actually collaborating in some way with Cambridge Analytica? Clearly, the data that was used by Cambridge Analytica was possibly not done in quite the way that it should have been, and clearly there was an argument to say that maybe where you're talking about holding pieces of personal data about your customers or your users, that's clearly quite an important principle. Okay, now the argument was and still is that as far as Facebook is concerned, they are pretty much absolutely 100% reliant on advertising revenue to generate their profits. And when there was this scandal, and it was a major scandal, I'm sure some of you might remember it. If you can't remember it, go and do a little bit of research on it. But fundamentally, that actually meant that a number of big advertisers chose to stop advertising on Facebook to distance themselves from Facebook because of the potential fines and litigation that Facebook were going to face. However, if we take, in the case of Mulberry, there were a few issues around some of their sales and the fact that in this case there was a loss of sales. Some were irrecoverable bad debts in that they were owed nearly £2.5 million. Those clearly would be the reasons why, in that case, they both had issues with falling profits. Okay. Now, in terms of how we might try and consider that, we haven't really talked too much about macroeconomics, but we will start to do that pretty much from there, even though we're still focusing on the micro bit of the course at this stage. But if we then take a look at some of the issues around falling company profits, both from a firm standpoint and also from the overall economy standpoint, here are some of the things that you could have considered. Okay, I'd like you to, before you actually look at these slides, just again have a go at putting micro and macro. You've got a table on page 61. Have a go at answering or trying to assess what some of the issues might be in terms of both micro and macro and the effects of falling profits or falling company profits. Okay, so let's take a look at a couple of those together then. First things first, if businesses are in markets that where company profits are falling, firms are likely to leave that industry. Okay, and if that happens, output will fall, prices may rise as supply falls and the supply curve shifts to the left. So this is on a microeconomic from a microeconomic standpoint. Okay, that could actually, to some degree, move towards better allocative and or productive efficiency. Okay, where the allocation of resources might become more efficient in that sense. If we're talking about macroeconomic effects, then, well, if companies have falling profits, then they might reduce their level of investment. It could then potentially increase unemployment as people think, well, maybe if profits are falling, we're going to need to find savings, and maybe that will mean that we have to make some job losses, and that's clearly going to increase unemployment. Could also reduce productivity, as again, if we've got less money to invest in the business, we might choose to spend less on education and training, and so that overall, if we have lots of businesses that are falling company profits, then the danger is that they may not be investing quite so much in education and training, and that's going to then reduce productivity overall within the economy. The other thing is that clearly we're going to get reduced corporation tax receipts, so the government isn't going to be able to collect as many as much corporation tax as previously, and that's going to cause a worsening of government finances. So you can see, and one of the things that we do need to do as we start to look at the overall course is to start looking at both the micro and the macro effects. Now, clearly, we haven't really covered macro at this stage. We've been significantly spending time on micro, but as time goes on, we'll start to consider that in a bit more detail too. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. The next thing that we'll do is to take a look at technological change, and that then will be the last presentation that you will need to look at for CC4. So thank you for listening once again, ladies, and we'll catch up on the tutorial literally, oh gosh, around about an hour and a half's time. Okay, so we'll look forward to seeing them. Thanks, bye.